So, Captain Marvel just had its big opening week. As with any major superhero movie, there's a lot of press, lots of attention, lots of buzz and people talking. And because Captain Marvel is a major action movie that does not star a white guy, some of the people talking are talking about how this film is propaganda. How it's just those damn SJWs again trying to cram representation and feminism down everyone's throats. You all know the basic beats of this argument. We've seen it plenty of times before. But all the people who were getting mad about the feminist politics of this movie, I'd say you're focusing on the wrong thing, because there is a much larger, actual problem at work here. Technically, these people are not wrong that Captain Marvel is in some way propaganda. They're just very wrong about what this film is propaganda for. A few quick things before we get started. First, there will be no spoilers in this. If you want to go watch Captain Marvel and enjoy it, have a fun day out at the movies, I will not ruin that for you. I will mostly be discussing the film's marketing, and I will not be talking about plot points that were not revealed in the marketing at all. I'm also not saying that you shouldn't enjoy and be excited about this movie. The fact that Marvel finally has a major motion picture centering a female hero is genuinely exciting. I also will not be ragging on Brie Larson here, an actor who I think's done some pretty great work. But it's also okay if you didn't like the movie. It is completely okay to either like or not like this movie. Hopefully either way you'll get something out of this video. Because this movie does provide an interesting opportunity to talk about an aspect of the entertainment industry that we often overlook. Secondly, for some non-regular viewers who might have stumbled across this, I just want to state up top that I'm a feminist. And I really support the idea of there being more female-led films. Hollywood in general is never as progressive as it thinks it is, and the ratio is still quite tilted. Now, if you're the kind of person who was attracted to the thumbnail Captain Marvel propaganda, you might be tempted to click away. Maybe leaving a comment on the way out about how this video is a sham and I suck or something. But I really encourage you not to. After all, maybe you're the kind of person who really likes facts and logic, and hey, you might as well hear some facts and logic presented from a different frame, a different point of view. And who knows, maybe you'll walk away from this video with some valuable new perspective. Because what I want to talk about today
The Air Force now is a blockbuster movie of its own. Marvel Studios' Captain Marvel
is how the military wants to use Captain Marvel as a recruiting tool. I am not just pulling things out of thin air or acting like a conspiracy theorist here. This is a report from Defense News, talking about the Air Force's hopes for the movie.
Do you think this might get people to join the Air Force?
They're certainly hoping so. When I talked to Brigadier General Leavitt about her participation in this film, she said that she hopes that a lot of people will look at this film and see what the Air Force has to offer.
And here is the Air Force Chief of Staff reacting to the Captain Marvel trailer. Yep, even high-ranking military officials do react videos now. That video genre is completely played out, unlike video essays, which will last forever. Anyway, back on topic.
The real question will be, not whether I want to go watch it, but it's more important, hey, do our young people across America want to go watch it? And will that get them fired up and inspired to want to come join us?
The Air Force was a huge part of the promotion for this movie. Pretty much every military blog or website has multiple articles about the movie up. There were little features with Air Force pilots and a flyover at one premiere. And the female Secretary of the Air Force even gave a speech at a Captain Marvel event held at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum. Apparently, the filmmakers collaborated with the Air Force during production, especially with Brigadier General Leavitt to develop Carol Danvers' character.
Our Public Affairs Office reached out to see if we could work with the Marvel team to help them in their character development for Captain Marvel.
And hey, here's Brie Larson herself talking about Air Force pilots.
That sense of humor mixed with total capability and whatever challenge comes her way, which I realized after going to the Air Force Base is really what Air Force pilots are like.
Now, Captain Marvel is by no means unique in this. The military promotes a lot of movies, especially sci-fi and superhero films, and especially the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But Captain Marvel is interesting in that it's loosely tying this military promotion to vague ideas about female empowerment. Essentially, it ends up using feminism to sell the military.
I'm excited to see Captain Marvel because being a hero is an equal opportunity.
In the last few years, you may have noticed a lot of ads using political or socially conscious messaging to sell their products. More often than not, these ads gesture towards progressive politics without actually taking much of a stand. And very often, these ads are targeted at women. They offer vague words of support that might make you feel, a little bit empowered, but won't be too alienating to people who don't like feminist messaging. They encourage you to be strong and powerful, but don't go much beyond that. It's all very shallow, taking vaguely liberatory language and wrapping it up to sell you shampoo. And oftentimes, these ads directly contradict the movements they claim to support. For example, Dove's Real Beauty campaign was supposedly all about body positivity and loving yourself for who you are. Take this ad where they force women to pick one of two doorways, one that says average and one that says beautiful. The crux of the ad is convincing these women that they are actually beautiful. Now, beauty is kind of a fraught concept. It carries a lot of cultural baggage, and the idea of beauty as an aspirational virtue has not exactly been a positive thing for a lot of women, or anyone else for that matter. So if this ad really cared about this, it should be pushing the idea that being average is okay, that attractiveness, beauty, is not the end-all, be-all. Yet instead, the message is more, you're probably hotter than you think you are, just have more self-confidence. Because this is not in any way about body positivity or accepting yourself. This is about selling soap. And it turns out that saying beauty and Dove really close together constantly mostly just makes people associate the brand Dove with the concept of beauty, which, hey, sells a lot more soap. Occasionally you'll have an ad that sort of talks about an actual political issue, like this deodorant ad about the wage gap, but it's all very inch deep. It's not really feminist, more like feminish. There have been a lot of really excellent video essays about this type of advertising recently. But something I think that's not talked about enough is this is not by any means a new trend. Advertisers have been leeching off the feminist movement for nearly a century now. Weirdly, one of the best ways to track this is the history of cigarette advertising. Way back in the early 1900s, smoking was considered largely a man's habit, something women mostly didn't do. This was very bad news for cigarette companies because it meant that 50% of the population was completely uninterested in buying from them. These companies knew that if they could figure out how to get women smoking, it would be like opening a gold mine right in our front yard. In the late 20s, one of the earliest smoking campaigns targeted towards women urged them to reach for cigarettes instead of sweets, which is an old fun advertising trick, making someone feel insecure about appearance and then offering a miraculous solution to their problem. But women still didn't want to smoke outdoors, which, again, cut into potential market share. The first real success was during New York's 1929 Easter Parade. Famous PR guy Edward Bernays, working for Lucky Strike, came up with the idea of backpacking off the suffragette movement, which had won women the right to vote less than a decade before. Bernays hired women to smoke during the parade. He managed to even secure support from a couple of activists, and Lucky Strike cigarettes were suddenly rebranded as torches of freedom. Suddenly, smoking and liberation were tied together, and cigarette sales among women started to rise. Some Lucky Strike competitors started to copy this strategy. Philip Morris even held a lecture tour where cigarette experts taught women the finer points of smoking, which, okay, to be honest, that one seems slightly more insulting than liberatory. Why do I need to learn this? From this point on, whenever the feminist movement was strong or female empowerment was trendy, cigarette companies would pop up to steal some of the spotlight. For example, during the Second World War, when women were working in factories, some companies happily played off of the Rosie the Riveter image. This really kicked off in the late 60s, when second wave feminism was in full swing, and Philip Morris decided it was the moment to make a cigarette just for women.
The good old days, when Mrs. Pamela Benjamin was caught smoking in the garden, she got a severe scolding and no supper that night. Then, at last, women won their rights.
You've come a long way, baby.
Introducing new Virginia Slims, the slim cigarette for women only, tailored for the feminine hand. Slimmer than the fat cigarettes men smoke, with flavor women like.
You've come a long way, baby, to get where you got to today. You've got your own cigarette now, baby. You've come a long, long way.
Honestly, I kind of love the suggestion that Virginia Slims are lighter and slimmer so they can fit a woman's hand better. My delicate hands hurt so badly when I have to bear the heavy load of a regular cigarette. Anyway, the You've Come a Long Way, Baby campaign is completely bizarre and fascinating to me. Many of the print and video ads run along this same theme, showing women pre-suffragette times who aren't allowed to smoke, and then the liberated modern businesswoman who can smoke all she wants. Cigarettes for liberation. These ads seem to suggest that right up there with fighting for the right to vote and ending domestic violence and more sexual liberation, women were fighting for the right to smoke, which I don't really remember that one from the history books. At most, that was a third or fourth tier concern. It can be easy to fool yourself, to look at these ads and see forward movement or innovation. But that's a facade. For one, especially with advertisers, if the cultural winds start to drift even slightly in a new direction, they will drop you immediately. The liberated 20s were followed by the more conservative 30s. Women went from workers in the 40s to housewives again in the 50s. And after the 60s and 70s was met by backlash from the 80s, well, by that point we were seeing more smoking PSAs than cigarette ads, but if you take a look at those...
Aren't you gonna kiss me?
Don't smoke, or you won't be hot anymore. Buying something can never really be activism, because it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change any laws or challenge any structures. But companies love to trick people into thinking this is what activism is. They want you to associate their brand with causes you care about. These cigarette companies used the ideas of feminism, of liberation, ideas that gave women rights, ideas that meant a whole lot to a whole lot of people. And these companies used these ideas to sell women something that was really, really bad for them. They used the desire for equality to give a bunch of people cancer. Because it turns out cigarettes are really bad for women. And everyone else too. And by the way, it should be noted that during this entire period of time, companies were simultaneously using masculine gender identity totems to sell cigarettes to men. You know, really strong masculine figures like that sexy, sexy Joe Camel. Oh my god. My larger point here is that it is relatively easy for advertisers to look at a movement that has put in a lot of work and brought a lot of liberatory, amazing things to a lot of people, movements that people consider important parts of their identity and hold close to their heart, and essentially just steal that movement's work. Those activists built us a really great brand, now we can repackage it slightly and harness the personal importance this holds for people to sell them something harmful. You like having the vote? Well, you'll love smoking. You liked equality? You liked being strong? Well, wait until you hear about the Air Force. The US military has a pretty cozy relationship with Hollywood. Every branch has an office in Los Angeles, and they frequently give movies both consultations and financial support. As I've said in previous videos, this affects strongly what kind of stories about the military get told. There's a real emphasis on showing everything in a good light, and smoothing out some of the things that maybe make life in the military not that great. Or well, I guess things can be not great as long as someone's being superficially badass. But movies funded by the Department of Defense tend to leave out both the more boring everyday ennui and the true deeper horror of what being in the military can actually mean. Sometimes this is subtle. For example, a line in Iron Man was tweaked slightly to remove any implication of soldiers committing suicide. Sometimes it's less subtle. For example, anytime you see a movie or show featuring the character Jack Ryan, that's pretty much just the CIA directly talking to you. It's very important for the military that US service members do not look malicious or incompetent. For example, in order to get helicopters for the finale of the film, the makers of James Bond GoldenEye had to change a bumbling US admiral into a Canadian. Sometimes they'll try to rewrite history. 13 Days, a drama about the Cuban Missile Crisis, got pushed back from the Pentagon because the generals were shown as wanting to invade Cuba.
The Soviet understands only one language, action, respects only one word, force.
They said this was inauthentic and wanted to have it changed, even though the movie was based on actual tapes from White House discussions during the crisis. Kevin Costner refused to change it, and the Pentagon pulled their initial support. Or you could look at Charlie Wilson's War, a film about the CIA-funded conflict between Afghans and Soviets in the late 1980s.
Charlie Wilson's War is a very interesting case. Got hold of a copy of the original script. The original script makes a very clear link between the US arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s and the causes of 9/11. Now, we know from a CIA advisor who was on set, he says we deliberately made sure we excised that from the film. And of course the end product is a much more tame version.
Consultants have asked that controversial orders and behavior are left out of supported projects, even if those orders actually happened. For example, in the film Wind Talkers, about Navajo soldiers who used their language as a code during wartime, it has been widely reported that the military had ordered Marines to kill any Navajo at risk of capture, in order to prevent the Japanese from learning the language and destroying the value of Navajo as a natural code system. Not only were these orders confirmed by the Navajos and other American soldiers, but the US Congress confirmed that such orders had been given. Yet it was the Department of Defense military liaison, not Congress, who could withhold support. So director John Woo relented and changed the scene to make it seem that such orders were implied when they were in fact express. Of course, you can still make movies about the military without Pentagon approval, and many people have. The Asylum, for example, shot their battleship ripoff on a museum ship. I also really enjoyed this anecdote about what they ended up doing on the set of 13 Days after their funding was pulled.
Had to rent jet airplanes of that era that didn't fly anymore, but they just had to drag them around on the tarmac behind tractors and then use computer-generated imaging to make them look like they're flying.
But given how expensive military equipment can be, and how lots of the major franchises are primarily business ventures, all about making as much money as possible, lots of filmmakers choose to just make the changes rather than risk support getting pulled. And a lot of the time, filmmakers end up censoring themselves, preemptively cutting out things they know will be controversial with military consultants. According to David Robb, who wrote the book Operation Hollywood, a lot of the studio heads tell their producers, "We're not going to make this film unless we get military assistance, because it would be too expensive. So you'd better make sure the script conforms to what they want." I asked Ridley Scott, the director, if Black Hawk Down would have been made without military assistance. He said, yeah, we would have just had to call it Huey Down. So there's this self-censorship. When you know the government is looking over your shoulder while you're typing, that's a very bad situation. And okay, this quote requires unexpected helicopter context, a subject about which I know almost nothing, but from what I can gather, the Black Hawk is currently in use and more modern, whereas the Huey is an older model, a little less flashy and less impressive. And there are a lot more Hueys in surplus out in the world than Black Hawks, so if there wasn't military support, that's what they would have had to go with. I'm pretty sure that's it. Gotta say, the world of military equipment is completely mysterious to me. What is any of this? All of this ensures that the military looks as good as possible to the eyes of the public. It's, well, clever marketing. Our desire is that the military are portrayed as good people trying to do the right thing the right way. That's probably our single most important imperative. By the way, this guy, Phil Strube, was a Pentagon liaison to Hollywood for like 30 years, and I truly envy his IMDb page. So many credits. This is all a bit creepy, but this is also a long history. The military has been using Hollywood to promote itself and its missions for a long time. The very first Academy Award for Best Picture went to Wings, which featured Army pilots. During the Second World War, the military asked directors and actors to help out in the war effort. Legendary director Frank Capra recalled being told by the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, they, the American Army, will prove not only equal but superior to totalitarian soldiers if they are given answers as to why they are in uniform, and if the answers they get are worth fighting and dying for. I think films are the answer, and you are the answer to such films. I am asking you to tell our young men why they must be in uniform and why they fight. One of the most famous successes of the military on film is Top Gun, which was made in collaboration with the Pentagon and was seen as helping complete the rehabilitation of the US military's reputation, which had been destroyed by the Vietnam War. After the movie came out, enlistment spiked. Some recruiters even set up tables at screenings. For a long time, the military tended to be strict on the kind of productions it would endorse. They were not all that into sci-fi, and they did not like movies that broke military law or that they deemed unrealistic. Famously, they did not fund G.I. Jane, because the main character received training that, as a woman, she would not have had access to at that time. But after the Bush years, things began to change a bit. After the Iraq War, the reputation of the US military had taken a bit of a hit. Thousands of soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi people had died in a war based on false pretenses. People still supported the troops, but the military less so. Recruitment became difficult, only boosted a bit by the 2008 financial crisis, because hey, nothing drives military recruitment like economic desperation. But the military needed to find a way to make the public trust them again. And so a few new things started happening. For one, in Hollywood suddenly the DoD started promoting more movies based on superhero and sci-fi worlds, showcasing heroic feats and the military protecting the US from existential supernatural threats. All very far away from the depressing realities of Afghanistan and Iraq. For example, Battleship was pretty much just a full-length commercial for the Navy. Pop Culture Detective has a great video on this aspect of military movies that I've linked in the description. For two,
when I was little, I wanted to grow up and help people.
When I was young, I wanted to save lives.
I wanted to make a difference in the world.
When I was growing up, I wanted to serve my country.
My name is Captain Shawnce Tarrant, Air Force physician.
I'm Airman First Class Ashley Denton, Air Force firefighter.
I am Lieutenant Colonel Gail Crawford, Air Force JAG.
I'm Captain Cynthia Nogueras, and I'm an American Airman.
I'm so inspired. Suddenly, the military seemed to be promoting more inclusion, seemed more accepting, especially of women. It seemed increasingly a place where women could have real agency, a place in society where equality and meritocracy reigned. Of course, the military trying to appeal to women is not a new practice by any means, but this felt like a distinct shift. In 2008, Congress had formed the Military Leadership Diversity Commission to figure out how to make the military's leadership structure better reflect the population of the US. And over the next few years, they recommended changes in recruitment practices. You started to see more women in recruitment ads, more women talking about their military experiences. Military websites and pages had sections devoted to women's service. Also, this is such a weird shot. How long did this family stay like this? In stark contrast to the strict adherence to military law, which prevented G.I. Jane from getting funding, the military happily contributed to this Katy Perry video where she joins the Marines and storms some beaches after a bad breakup, even though at the time this video was made, not all of these combat roles would have been available to her. The military, much like cigarette companies before it, had realized that only appealing to half the population was not a winning strategy. And it strikes me how similar a lot of these videos and ads are to the vague, feminist messages you see in shampoo commercials. Lots of language about being strong and working towards your goals, but often a total avoidance of substantive politics. Which is weird since the military is, politics. And even with Trump in office, this branding continues. Sometimes the more contentious nature of the times do show through, but mostly this branding is still going strong. And we started to see military contractors pick up this branding too. Hey, Raytheon, a major weapons manufacturer whose bombs keep mysteriously killing people in Yemen, is teaching Girl Scouts how to code now. And good news.
Military-industrial complex. The CEOs of 4 of the 5 biggest defense contractors are in fact women.
This is obviously what I've always wanted. Again, like with the cigarette commercials, it's easy to look at this and see progress.
You think that women can run defense companies better than men, or they can run all companies better than men?
After all, more women in top roles? That's a good thing, right? They'll bring new perspectives and experiences to the table. But just because women can now serve in the highest ranks, it does not make any of this feminist. This is not a feminist institution. Obviously, if a woman wants to serve in combat, she should have the right. But the military is incredibly harmful to women. And, well, men, incidentally. And everyone. Not only within its ranks, but all over the world. For example, even after years of scandals, the military is still plagued by sexual assault. At least 32% of female military members have been sexually assaulted during service. And the percentage of men assaulted might be even higher. Honestly, it's hard to know the exact numbers because too often people are shamed into not reporting. The suicide rate among veterans is double the general population. And as much as we constantly hear support the troops, often the actual military structure leaves them behind. I watched a bunch of different news reports about military suicide while making this video, and it struck me how often the military discouraged veterans from seeking PTSD treatment. Because doctors are expensive, and we all know the military is just so broke. Their solution to these issues seems to be to show soldiers slideshows that tell them not to do these things. Yeah, just throw a poorly made PowerPoint at the problem. That'll solve everything. And then there's the military's effect on people around the world. At least 8,000 civilians were killed or injured in Afghanistan last year. It was the deadliest year for Afghani civilians since the UN began tracking casualties there. Last year, over 1,100 children died in Syria, some of whom were killed by U.S. airstrikes. The U.S. military and contractors have given both weapons and military support to the Saudi-led war on Yemen, which has directly killed between 8,000 and 13,000 people, and has driven a famine that has killed at least 85,000 children. And we've been secretly entering into several conflicts on the African continent. For example, apparently we are now at war in Somalia. A lot of this has been purposefully conducted without the consent or even the knowledge of the American public. But in my opinion, if you consider yourself a feminist, you cannot support the success of a couple of women at the top of the defense structure while ignoring the suffering they have wrought upon a much greater number of women around the world. Kara Ellerby, author of the excellent No Shortcut to Change, said, "Sure, it's great that you have a woman at the head of Raytheon, but what about the women who those bombs are being dropped on? From a global perspective, putting women in charge of U.S. military dominance is not remotely feminist. It's imperialist." Yes, maybe these women are leaning in and bringing new experiences to the workplace and giving their companies a sweeter, kinder, more compassionate perspective. These CEOs and their branding certainly want you to think this.
You go, girl.
But here's the thing. They absolutely aren't. Despite the fact that women are now in charge of the military-industrial complex, it still seems like we're engaging in the exact same kinds of foreign intervention as we always have. The kind of person who can move all the way through the ranks of the military or companies like Raytheon, well, they've proven themselves to be harsher, more hawkish, willing to do what needs to be done.
I look out in the crowd today and I see a strong representation of the CIA's past, present, and possibly even the future. I am looking at two young ladies, special guests, who join us today.
There is no evidence that I've seen of the CIA, Defense Department, or other institutions where only a few women are rising to the top, that they challenge the mission of the company or the organization. The focus of any feminist, of anyone who wants to change the world for the better, should be radically changing or dismantling these structures. The military-industrial complex as it stands now is a giant, horrific behemoth. It eats up so much tax money that the US can't have normal social programs that every other country has. It often leads to absolute misery for its soldiers, and it destroys the lives of people around the world. Anyone who really wants to improve the lives of all women will recognize that this entire structure is completely incompatible with that goal. That in order to make lives better, we need a whole hell of a lot more than a few women sprinkled into a corrupt system. Which brings me back to Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel is the first film focused on a female superhero that Marvel has put out, so obviously they've been leaning into that in the marketing.
I really like the her a hero. I like that.
They've been advertising it alongside traditionally feminine products. They've put together special events so young girls can go to screenings. They've set up interviews where little girls get to talk to the stars of the film. This should all be a really positive thing. It can mean a whole lot for a kid to see themselves reflected, strong and powerful, on the big screen, to have larger-than-life role models in fiction. But alongside this, something else is being sold too.
I have had so many opportunities since joining the Air Force.
The Air Force recently put out an all-female ad that doesn't mention Captain Marvel by name, but frames joining the military as a superhero origin story.
Every superhero has an origin story.
Clearly there's some synergy going on here. And that Captain Marvel event in the Air and Space Museum, which was largely targeted towards young girls who want to get involved in STEM, well, just like Top Gun before it, there were recruiters on hand at the screening. Just there, ready to talk to you about military life as you make your way in to see the movie at the Lockheed Martin Theater. At the event, Secretary of the Air Force Heather Wilson said, "I'm hoping this event reaches young people about who they can become. And particularly, I'm glad to see so many young girls here." Honestly, this is the thing that disturbs me most about all of this. The fact that they are specifically targeting young girls. Girls excited to finally see themselves on screen.
And it's exciting to me to think that perhaps this film will spark something in little girls to see that they can fly.
Just like cigarette companies in times past, the military is tying empowerment and feminism and the desire to live your life equally to others to something that will very probably be bad for you and for others. The military seems to like the MCU because the military's brand, as it were, is heroism. That's why we get military flyovers at games featuring the sports heroes we look up to. That's why the military backs blockbusters based on beloved childhood toys and comic book heroes. And while the military constantly denies they are trying to brainwash people, well, this is what brainwashing is. It's not prying someone's eyes open until they change their ways or making them watch something spin and saying, "You're getting very sleepy." It's showing, throughout a lifetime, a military that's compassionate and effective and always with the heroes. A military with all the negatives painted over. A military that cares about you and the causes you care about. And when these images are repeated and repeated and repeated throughout a lifetime, you might grow to support this military and whatever they do. And eventually you might even say, yeah, I think I will sign up and make a difference. All that nostalgia, all those warm feelings towards childhood heroes, that should all eventually color your decision making. After all, that is the entire point of marketing, to use emotions to manipulate your choices. If it didn't work, they wouldn't put money into it. I've seen some people say that the film subverts all of this, that it maintains an anti-war message. I disagree. Because those messages are largely centered around a fictional military, while the actual real-world one is mostly portrayed well, as a source of friendship and love. So I don't think everyone will make the connection. It becomes too easy to write off as fiction. Plus the Air Force, well, they seemed pleased with the final result.
So, Steve, the Air Force obviously put a good bit of money and a good bit of time into supporting Marvel Studios and all this. Do you think they got their money back?
The Air Force ends up having kind of less screen time than one might have thought from watching some of the behind-the-scenes material. But what's there is good. The Air Force scenes are good, and the Air Force backstory sets the tone for the film.
Lots of people online these days act like feminism is a big scary thing that's out to eat all media and kill childhoods. But honestly, the goals of the feminist movement are just liberation from the gender norms that make women, men, and non-binary people incredibly unhappy. There are, of course, a few really awful elements of the movement that do not promote these ideas, but mostly, the idea that is, as long as you're not harming anybody, you should be able to be whoever you want to be. If you want to be the mustier guy, that's okay. If you want to wear a dress, that's okay too. What we're working towards is a world where you won't have to fit yourself into old societal boxes and roles if that's not where you best fit. I know this might sound crazy to some of you, but feminists want you to be happy. Whereas the US military, a big scary thing that has actually managed to worm its way into a lot of media, what they want is for you to give your body, your mind, and sometimes your life to a war with no end in sight. I'm not telling you not to enjoy Captain Marvel. I'm not canceling it. I do not, in fact, have the power to cancel a movie by a major corporation. But I am telling you to be aware of these things when you watch, and try not to let your love for a genre or a hero or a cause sell you something that, well, you might not love. Hey everyone, thank you for watching. I realize this is not the most unique Captain Marvel take, but I thought it'd be good to compile all of this on video somewhere just so you know it exists. I also apologize that this is not the police procedural video. I've put that on hold slightly. I hit a bit of a wall with it, and I'm going to wait to proceed until I get a few materials in. Thank you to my lovely patrons, including Rowan Quinn and Luna Schindler. Also, thank you to everyone who donated to my Ko-Fi and everyone who recommended jobs. You're all helping me put my life back together, which I really appreciate. If you want to donate again, which again I'd really appreciate, links are in the description. Thank you all so much again, and everyone have a great day.